Hey, this is Craig at Bull Strong. I'm excited today to have Treena Elliott, a good friend and a coworker, with me on the show. We're going to be talking about a few things, and one of the big ones is gaps in resumes and how people should deal with gaps. If they're explainable gaps or unexplainable gaps, and how a recruiter might look at those gaps. And so, without any further ado, let's welcome Treena Elliott onto the show. Yeah, so great to have you with us today, and we have some cool things to talk about. Welcome.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, thanks, Craig.
All right. We got going offline and we started talking too much. We should have just been recording everything.
No, I feel like you need to loop that stuff back in.
And maybe we'll just rip it back in, and maybe we will. So one of the things we were talking about is, maybe it comes out of the fact that there's a bit of a trend here where people they worked pre-COVID. A lot of people were laid off. A lot of people's jobs changed. And there was this trend to possibly not be in the right job or have a big gap in a resume. And you've been working closely with some senior individuals to get their resumes on point. And I guess one of the topics was, what happens when there's a gap in a resume and we now need to, to work on that gap? How do we, I guess you can't fix it. A gap's a gap, but what do we do?
Right. So it depends on the gap. Isn't that the worst answer to a question? It depends.
It depends. Yeah. Okay. Next question.
No. So it really does depend. It depends on a couple of different things. So it depends on how long the gap was, right? Like, let's say you resigned from a job, you were laid off, and that gap is like less than 3 months. Mm-hmm. You don't need to worry about that gap.
Right.
Like, you just, you might not even update your LinkedIn during that time. You might just leave it as your current employer. And there might be some controversy around that, but there's no hard and fast rule that says the moment that you resign from a job, you need to immediately update your LinkedIn that day. You could, right.
Yeah.
But the LinkedIn police aren't going to come after you and say, you don't work there anymore. So if it's a short gap, for sure, if you're sending out your resume, you should update it because your resume should have the most up-to-date information. But if your gap is, say, less than 3 months, don't even worry about it. Okay. Right? Like, you've never been in an interview with a candidate, and, if they've worked consistently throughout their whole career and then they haven't worked for 2 months, I mean, you're not going to chastise them for that, right? Yeah. And even now during COVID, I feel like that sort of 3-month rule of thumb has probably been extended, right? If I see a gap on someone's resume now that's a year, well, because of COVID, there might be more to that story that I don't know about. So I think that more than anything, honesty is the best policy, and not trying to hide gaps. I find it frustrating, and you and I were just looking at some resume examples, is I find it really frustrating on a resume when it's really difficult to find information quickly.
Right.
Right? Like, if I'm looking at a resume, so let's say I'm hiring for a role, I have a stack of resumes, and from said stack of resumes, I'm trying to determine who the most qualified people are. The resumes that I like are the ones that tell me what I need to know quickly.
Right.
20 years experience in this space, experience doing XYZ, and then always a chronological resume. I don't know, maybe you have some thoughts on this, but I don't really like when people take the chronological resume and then turn it into something different. Like, this is my management skills, this is my technical skills. I still like to see it chronologically.
Yeah,
because I feel like when people take it out, I feel like they're trying to hide something. And as someone who, and like yourself, we've spent so much of our career looking at resumes. I just need you to tell me your experience so that I can decide if you're qualified for this role or not. And if there is a history of a bunch of gaps, maybe that's a red flag, but it might not be a red flag too. A big example, and I've worked with a lot of moms lately on their resumes. So a maternity gap is a big gap. And so just say on your resume, career sabbatical, maternity leave.
Yeah.
Easy. Yeah. And then And if it's, people end up in situations where maybe they were had a medical leave, they might have been in a car accident, or maybe they had to take
Yeah.
care of an elderly parent, then put career sabbatical, family, family leave or something like that, just to explain the gap. I mean, if you have a gap for 2 or 3 years because you haven't been able to find a job, that could be tricky.
Right.
If that's the case, then you would hope that that person would have been doing something else during that time, maybe taking some courses, maybe upgrading their skills, maybe taking a pay the bills job, whatever that might be. So a job that's maybe outside of their, where they're trying to, let's say, and this happens a lot with new immigrants, right? Like a new immigrant who's, say, a chemical engineer and has to wait a while to make sure all their stuff with a PEGA goes through. Well, maybe they have to go work at Walmart, and there's no shame in that. So just putting that on your resume, and you have to trust that the person reading your resume has a critical enough eye to say, okay, I see the bigger picture here. This person's new to Canada. They worked at Walmart. They're clearly an engineer. Okay, great.
Yeah, I think you bring up two really interesting points, and hopefully I can remember both of them. But one is, like, obviously, if there's a small gap and it's at the end and it's between, recently and now, that's not that big of a deal. Other gaps where, you mentioned, like being on maternity leave or whatever, those can happen anywhere in a resume, and those aren't that important that much. I've always seen. But the one thing that's interesting is that hopefully when people are unemployed, they're actually doing something.
Right.
That they're not doing nothing. And so
Right.
maybe it's a sign. If you're unemployed for, a handful of weeks or a month, okay, vacation's over, time to you got to do something and
Right.
get back into it. But what is interesting as well is, I think sometimes we see resumes, and you've probably seen these as well, where suddenly we have not just gaps, but there's more than one gap, and then there isn't a we said chronological resume, but we're also seeing this improving
Right.
improving role over time. And when we see roles that maybe even you backslide in your career, we start to ask some questions there. And I don't think you can hide those things, but I think you have to do some introspection too, because it isn't just about creating this unbelievably beautiful resume. You do have to work on yourself too, because your resume is just a reflection of you. So
yes.
yeah, you gotta work on both at the same time.
Yeah. And then, so I did a resume for a friend not too long ago, who was concerned about the fact that she has done a lot of different things.
Yeah.
So, maybe been with one job for 2 years and then was doing a contract, and then, maybe was working in another job. She moved, she came back, and she wanted to apply for this specific role.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, Treena, well, how do I, she used a really great term, and shoot, I should have looked it up before I just thought of it now, where she's like, how do I make that look like an asset and not a liability? Because she's like, because what I've actually been doing for the last 20 years has sort of like been the culmination of this job. And so I've been doing all these little things. And it wasn't that she's the kind of employee that quits and then finds another job. Like, so much of it was organic.
Right.
So I was like, okay, well, we're going to bring that together to say you have 20 years of event management experience.
Right.
Because that's what you have. Sure, it's been all over the place, but someone with a critical eye and who knows a bit about event management and contract work will see through that and be able to see that. And so we talked about on her resume, front and center under that, career summary that I like to use, 20 years of event management experience, manage budgets of up to, $5 million or whatever that was. So highlighting all of those things that she's done to show that she's not flaky, because she was like worried that she was going to look flaky. I'm like, no, we're going to spin this in a way to show that all of this has led to this point. And she got the job. So we did a good job on that.
Yeah.
Because there wasn't a lot of gaps, but there was a lot of contract work. And it's like, okay, well, we're going to put all that contract work in there chronologically to show, okay, yeah, it was contract work, but It was, I worked on this project from beginning to end. So it was a lot of completed projects. It wasn't a lot. And I would say that engineers probably do this a lot too, where they work on one project beginning to end. Maybe the company where they're at doesn't have a project starting, but another company does. So they go and do that. So beginning to end. So with engineers specifically, because engineers are notorious for having excruciatingly long resumes. So a lot of times with engineers, I take their project work out and I put it on a separate document. So here's my career, and then here's my project work, so that it's really easy on the eye for a project manager or hiring manager to be like, okay, this is where this individual's worked. Okay, this is all the projects that they've worked on from beginning to end.
Right. I think that brings up an interesting point where we see, and engineers are a good example, but it's across the board where we see people on their resumes, they feel this need to write down every single thing that they ever did in every job. And then instead of saying, I did this role and here are the 5 main things I did, they get excruciatingly into the detail. And nobody's really reading that, I don't think. Maybe they do, but like once you see that, like there's no way. The reality is if you look at a 15 line items for a single job, there's no way you're even doing that stuff all the time. Like it's just a small part of the career. And so hopefully it comes out in the interview, but you don't need to list everything.
Well, and that's interesting, because I tell people when I'm chatting with them on the phone about doing their resume, well, number one, we've never been taught how to do a resume, right? Like, I talk to clients, literally CEOs and C-suite people who come to work with me on their resume. They're like, oh yeah, I haven't thought about my resume or how to do a resume since that one class they talked about it for 1 hour in university. I'm like, yeah, I hear you. And I'm like, so people at a really high level. So I see C-suite resumes that are formatted and look exactly the same as a new grad, because we don't know. So, and then, so my second point with that is I also see people on resumes just copy and paste their job description onto their resume.
Right.
To the point where I've seen and other duties as required.
Oh my goodness, that is awesome. I love that.
And like really senior level people, but you can't fault them, right? Like we don't know. And so, because again, I've spent so much time looking at resumes, it's like, I just want to know your impact in that role. I don't need to know what you did. I can read your job and see mechanical engineer. Okay, well, you were a mechanical engineer, right? But what was your impact? What did you catch a big error that you fixed on a project? So just like getting to the punch of it, like what are you really good at, and where do you make an impact?
What matters?
Right. What matters? Like, I don't need to know that you sign off, and I'm trying to think of like some engineering, like typical engineering examples, but you know what I mean? Like I know what a mechanical engineer does on an oil and gas project. And anybody who is reading an oil and gas mechanical engineering resume also knows what they do, but they want to know, okay, well, what projects did you work on and what were some of the challenges in that project? They don't need to have you regurgitate your mechanical engineering job description. They're well aware.
100%. What about, you mentioned and other duties as required. What about putting in hobbies and stuff at the end, or other interests, or like how do you layer that in, or do you ever?
I totally do. And I get some pushback on there. So when I do someone's resume, I send them a questionnaire. And then one of the questions that I have is, tell me about you. What do you like to do? What's your favorite kind of food? What's your favorite dish? And I say the reason I put that on there is because I usually write a blurb on people's resume on the second page near the end that's an about me, that says, oh, Treena, I'm hard for me to think on the spot with this one, but Treena loves like Hawaiian pizza. There's no shame in pineapple on pizza, right? Because that's like a funny debate. And it might seem a little cheesy, and if it doesn't resonate with people, then I leave it off. But the reason that I leave it on and don't just have a list of words like under, on my resume, I would never say like interest, pizza, wine, blah, 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 but like a little bit of a story, because I think that resumes are a good storytelling tool. And the reason that I put a little blurb about, your actual interest with some character is because it finds commonality. Right? Like, how often have you been in it's a great icebreaker. So let's say, for example, someone's meeting me for the first time and they see on my resume that I like pineapple pizza and they hate pineapple pizza. Well, isn't that a fun banter? Or like, let's say right now with hockey, if someone's a Flames fan interviewing an Oilers fan, well, then you're instantly getting into some banter so that the interview flows a little bit nicer. So I do it as, an icebreaker more than anything.
Right.
And I keep it small.
What's the worst one? Have you ever had a bad one on a resume you've had to deal with? I have
like
one.
A bad.
Terrible.
Oh, no.
So the worst one I ever had was I had someone applied and the last line in their resume was other interests. And one of them was partying on weekends.
Oh.
Wow. Thank you that it's only on weekends, but yeah.
Right. Well, and someone might put on their resume that they like, entertaining entertaining with wine at their house. Well, that's fun. That's so different. They like to host parties. So, I mean, that's maybe like, a young person. And if someone wanted to put that on their resume, I might say that you enjoy, you're a social person that likes being around other people.
Yeah, there's a better way
that's a better way.
Yeah, a little bit better spin. So yeah, okay. Well, yeah, and I guess I have always thought that there is a roundedness to the hobbies piece, but I felt too that as soon as it got too much, like as soon as your hobbies started to exceed your employment background, then it starts to get a little nutty. So like keep it to a couple lines and you don't have to overdo it. So
I'm like, don't just make a list of things, like have a little bit of interest in it, because it just adds personality. It helps tell the story. Maybe you coach your kids soccer, and maybe the person that's about to interview, maybe they coach soccer too. You have that in common. Almost really, that's the point of that, is we almost always have one thing in common with every person. So if you have an opportunity to catch that on a resume, they're like, oh, because sometimes people will put, the last book they read.
Right.
Well, maybe you read that book too, and maybe you talk about that for 5 minutes. So you're just connecting and building a rapport with a person before you start talking about your experience. And don't we all like to work with people that we get along with and can have good conversation with?
Yeah.
So that's why I do that.
Yeah. No, I like that. Have you seen any other than, like, I think we were talking offline that there's a bit of a trend towards putting a picture on a resume now, because it's actually, here's a crazy story, Treena, I forgot to tell you about earlier. Is I was talking to a recruiter from another company, and she said that their corporate policy is that if your LinkedIn does not have a picture, they do not look at you. That's crazy.
What kind of company was it?
They were doing they do recruiting in all over North America, and for mostly technical roles, but they don't deal with anyone on LinkedIn without pictures.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think that might.
Yeah, they just said that maybe, like, I guess it ups the ante of that person not being real. So they just, if you're real, you get a picture.
Right. Yeah. So that's interesting. And yeah, you're right. So when we were talking about this offline, so I always feel like it starts to date me when I say how long I've been in recruitment. But when I started recruiting, but like 20 years ago, LinkedIn wasn't a thing. Social media wasn't a thing. So putting your picture on your resume wasn't really a thing. It was kind of frowned upon. You would see resumes from different countries where it was quite common, like in, like resumes from the Philippines or resumes from like Dubai and around there, that was, and in India. So it might, like 20 years ago, it must have been quite common to do that. When 20 years ago, you would see a picture and you're like, oh, like that's tacky.
Yeah.
And then, insert, here comes social media. And so now I would say that you should have if you're going to be on LinkedIn, you should have a picture, or don't bother being on there.
Yeah.
Right.
It's an interesting trend. I think part of the trend was that there was this era of, I don't know if I'm discriminating at this point, and then simply having your picture on your resume may make me discriminate in some weird way, but then the picture's on LinkedIn anyway. So I
Right.
think the
So
pendulum shift.
yeah, so exactly. And for sure that argument was had some validity to it, 15, 20 years ago, but now people's pictures are everywhere.
Yeah.
So I tell people a couple of different things. When I do their resume, I ask, do you want to put your picture on it? That decision I leave totally up to you, because I don't actually have an opinion about your having a picture on your resume either way. If it makes you uncomfortable, we're not going to do it.
Right.
If you have a good professional looking headshot and you feel good about it and you feel that it represents you, let's put it on, make it look good. So that's on resume. So I'm neutral on resume photos. On LinkedIn, it's kind of a must.
Yeah.
Again, what's the point? And then I tell people that LinkedIn is not Facebook, it's not Instagram. So make sure that picture is professional looking. I'm a big fan of professional headshots. I've had them done. I really like my pictures. I think they represent my brand, but I don't think they're necessary. I think that I tell people to just go to YouTube and watch a video on how to take a nice looking headshot with your phone and get your spouse, friends, or kid to take a half decent photo of you, pop that on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
That's all you need. And I tell people the reason for that is that if you and I hadn't met and we connected and you wanted to interview me for a role, let's say we were going for coffee, I just want to see what you look like. Oh, Craig.
There he is.
I recognize you from LinkedIn.
Yeah.
So that's really the only reason. And I feel like I've had people say, well, isn't that grounds for discrimination? It's like, well, social media is just part of who we are now. So
yeah, it's certainly, if someone was going to discriminate, then yeah, it would be. But I think you and I see that the amount of discrimination goes on is really based on, can you do the job or not? That's the most important, most critical thing. And, it doesn't really much matter otherwise.
And you would hope not. But I mean, gosh, if someone's going to discriminate against you, you probably don't want to work for their company.
No kidding.
Right.
Yeah, totally.
And actually, so that brings up a good point too. Just getting back to moms. I do quite a few mom resumes for moms that are wanting to get back into the workforce after, say, taking a career break with their kids. And then with the about me piece, and it's funny because men never bring this up when I do their resumes and they talk about watching their kids and sports or something. And women are like, oh, well, should I put that on my resume that I have kids? Will they discriminate against me? I'm like, okay, number one, something that I've learned when I started having kids is that almost everybody eventually has children. And all of those people who eventually have children also have jobs. The vast majority of people I know have jobs and kids.
Yeah.
Right.
Make it work. Make it work.
Everybody has. And I also feel like, it's 2022. There's so many professional women in the workforce that the stigma around moms working has diminished greatly.
Oh yeah.
And I wouldn't want, and if, there might be some employers out there that discriminate against that. And then they don't deserve to have you as an employee, because I know that since I've become a mom, I'm so efficient with my time that if any company wouldn't want to hire me because I have kids, well, that's your loss, because I can make stuff happen. Moms can make things happen. Totally. Yeah. So put it on your resume and don't worry about it, because anyone who's going to discriminate against you because you're a mom with kids, you don't want to work there. And it's just not as common anymore. No, right?
And I think too, one of the, most employers these days are wildly flexible. If a mom or a dad needed to go pick up a kid because there was an issue, there's not an issue with doing that. I think where it becomes the issue is when, a person's taking a half day every few days because they can't manage what they have on the go. And maybe at the end of the day, maybe that's not the right job for them, because they can't devote a 40-hour work week. They can only devote a 30-hour work week. So maybe they just need to be upfront with that. So, but it catches us off guard. Being a parent's got a lot of unknowns. And so if we figure it out as we go, I suppose.
Right. But then also too, in most situations, right? Like my kids are small, your kids are
big,
like in their 20s. So if I, anytime I've said to you, oh man, my kids are sick, you've been like, I remember those days.
Yeah. Exactly.
Right. Like you're a parent with kids that are older. So anytime that I tell you a situation with my kids, you're like, I remember.
Yeah.
So it's just having a level of compassion with people, right? Like, oh, okay, like I get it. Like if someone's a good employee, then they're gonna figure it out. Like,
100%.
Kids get sick, and especially even more so now post-COVID, because now people just work from home is more generally accepted. So if someone says to you, oh, I'm gonna work from home, my kid is sick, and today in 2022, post-COVID, you're like, okay, I guess. Not I guess. You're like, okay.
Yeah, got it. Yeah. You know what? Right? That actually brings up an interesting point. This is kind of off the resume piece, but in the working from home component, I think just as I'm thinking about the whole, like, do you work from home? Is it hybrid or not? I think if I were coaching someone today and they were going off to an interview, the question we've been getting a lot is this job hybrid? Is this job work from home? And I think there's a better question, because I think that opens the door to some connotation about your expectations. I think it's a better question to ask, how has your company been dealing with this work from home sort of environment? Like, what have you guys been doing? How have you been handling it and seeing through it? Because then it lets the company explain their situation before you show your cards to them, right? Because that can be dangerous to show your cards when you may not know what your cards are just yet.
Right. And also, like, I've had candidates more so post-COVID that tell me, like, I want to work from home. And so that will knock them out of certain jobs, because some companies will be like, well, we want you in the office. And I don't think that there's any right or wrong with that. If you want to work from home 100%, then then that's fine. That's what that's what you might need for your lifestyle. That's what I need for my lifestyle. But if you can't expect a company to want to do that. And there's now, again, post-COVID, there is every single imaginable combination.
Oh yeah.
Some, like Elon Musk just say he's like bringing Tesla employees have to go back to work.
Yeah, you can work here for 40 hours or work from home for someone else, more or less. Yeah.
And some people are fine like that. Like, you're the kind of person that likes getting up and going to work every morning. My husband is the kind of person that gets up and goes to work every morning. And even at the height of COVID, was still going into the office, because that's just who he is. Right. Like, that's just who you are. And so some people they need that separation. Yeah. Between work and home. And that's fine. And some people don't. And that's fine too.
Yeah. Well, and if and it comes down to, can you get it done? And it may be, can you get the work done? And I think that's an interesting component on a resume. That's always one of the harder things to sell, I think, is I can always tell you that I can use this software, that I've built this building, that I know how to do this thing, but it's harder to say I'm really good. Like I'm valuable and I'm worth it. I'm worth your time as a company to consider me. That's a hard one. I don't know how you convey that, because it's an important message to say I'm worth considering.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I mean, again, on my resumes, I try to take out the fluff. So I try not to use a lot of like fluffy adjectives.
Yep.
And I try to just get to the accomplishments. What have you accomplished? So that when someone like me or you is looking at a candidate's resume, I just want to see what you've done.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
I don't need the fluff. I don't need to know that you're like, think of all of
Always
those
happy.
generic, well, think about all those, it's like my pet peeve, all the generic objectives that say looking for a career with a growing company where I can work independently in a team and multitask, right?
With
Like,
little or
okay,
no supervision and
right,
lots of
yeah,
supervision, whatever you want.
right. So I always take that off a resume. I'm like, well, no, just like tell me what you accomplished.
Yeah, no, I agree. You know, maybe as a last point, Treena, it would be interesting, you know, and I think you and I would be on the same page that getting help building a resume, anyone can build a resume. There's templates, you can do it, but there's value in having a third party, someone who's not emotionally invested in your success in your career,
Yeah.
helping you be clear on your resume. So what do you tell people? Like, you got to have people coming to you saying, maybe they're not saying it, but they're kind of saying, I could do this myself. I'm not sure why I'm using you.
Right. That's great. So I've never met a human being who has said, Treena, I love updating my resume. I love it. So fun.
Really?
Never met a single person. So nobody likes it. I don't
Yeah.
even know why I like doing it. I don't like, well, okay, for example, I don't have an updated resume. I don't
Yeah.
want to do my own. I would actually, I don't know. I might pay someone to do my own because like I don't like to talk about my, like it's hard. It's
Yeah.
hard. No one knows how is the only reason I'm any good at this is because I've been staring at resumes for the last 20 years. So why not have someone who has literally stared at 100,000 resumes do your resume for you,
Right.
and help you, right? Like I was trying to think of an example of all the things that we have other people do for us because it's easier than doing it ourselves.
Well, going
right?
to a restaurant,
Right.
changing your tires. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a million things.
And just having that critical eye, right? Like I know how to say to somebody, let's just get to the point.
Yeah.
Because we get stuck in our own heads so much. I think that's the biggest thing is I will get you out of your own head.
Right.
You're stuck in your own head. You're staring at this document. You're trying to figure out how to best represent yourself. Like you're an engineer, for example, going back to engineers, an engineer is good at engineering. Why would they be good resume writers?
Yeah, that's right.
Where's that correlation? Like the best resumes that I end up seeing are marketing people or graphic designers because they know how to make it look nice and they know how to sell things. But you can't expect everybody across every industry to also be really good resume writers. Like, why would you expect that from
Well, I think
somebody?
a third party can always look at your resume and you may be very, very clear on what you do, but when you explain it to someone, not so much. And then that third party person can say, I don't understand what you do for a living, and I need that to be captured on your resume.
Yeah.
It needs to be clear. So yeah.
And also people always, so my favorite clients are the ones that don't leave it to the last minute.
Yeah.
Right? That are like, hey, I'm pretty happy right now. I haven't updated my resume in a while. I don't want to get caught in a situation where someone asks me for my resume tomorrow and I haven't updated it in 5 years. Those are my favorite clients because we have time to let it breathe and get the right information on there. It's when I get somebody and I charge them more if someone's like, I need a resume tomorrow. I'm like, oh man, like I can do that for you, but it's not going to be as good as if we like give ourselves some breathing room. So as a professional, you should always have your professional resume ready to go because you never know. And, as recruiters, we know this. It's all about good time. It's all about good timing.
Yeah, 100%. And you never know who needs it. Like even if you're fully employed, you may need it for, like some sort of proposal that you're doing for a company or a bank or whatever that you're working with.
Yeah. Or I have a lot of clients that are interested in board of director positions, right? They're looking to advance their career in that direction. So they're not looking for a job, but they're looking for, that increased, increasing professionalism or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. No, that's awesome.
Right? So lots of people that are, oh, okay, well, I want to start, I'm a senior manager, I eventually want to be CEO. So I want to be on some board of directors. So, this company, I love what they do. I would love to get on their board. Like, okay, well, those resumes are great to do.
Yeah, those are awesome. So,
yeah.
Well, listen, we booked this amount of time, and I know you have a life beyond this. So we'll cut it, and we'll have to come back again and do more. So thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been fun.